On my daughter's wedding day, her mother-in-law gave her a maid's uniform and my new son-in-law smiled like it was funny. So I stood up, reached into my purse, and gave Emily the one gift that made their entire family go silent. I have attended 214 court hearings in my professional life. I have sat across negotiating tables from men who thought their net worth was a personality. I have signed documents that moved money most people will never see in 3 lifetimes, and I have done it without my voice shaking once. I know how to stay calm when the room is trying to swallow me whole, but nothing, not a single deposition, not a single adversarial closing argument, not a single 3 a.m. phone call from a client in crisis, prepared me for the sight of my daughter standing in her wedding dress while her mother-in-law pressed a maid's uniform into her hands and grinned like she'd just solved something. Emily's name was stitched on the chest pocket in navy blue thread, neat and permanent, like a verdict. I sat at table 3 with a glass of wine I hadn't touched and watched my daughter's chin start to tremble, and I thought, this is the moment. This is exactly the moment I bought that apartment for. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without context. And I am, above all things, a woman who believes in context. My name is Catherine Voss. I am 53 years old. For 26 of those years, I have been a real estate attorney specializing in high-asset property disputes, estate planning, and what my colleagues generously call legally airtight vindictiveness. I operate out of a mid-sized firm in Philadelphia. I drive a 7-year-old Volvo because I believe in reliability over performance. I keep a calendar on paper because I don't entirely trust the cloud with things that matter. I raised Emily alone after her father, David, died when she was 9. Pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to funeral. I have never fully recovered from that, and I don't believe I'm supposed to. What I did instead was rebuild, methodically, quietly, into something David would have recognized as functional, and something Emily could lean on without it collapsing. She turned out extraordinary, despite everything I got wrong. Emily is 28. She has a master's degree in social work from Penn. She runs a nonprofit that provides transitional housing support to women exiting the foster care system. She works 60-hour weeks for a salary that would make my colleagues wince, and she does it without complaint, without grandiosity, with this quiet ferocity that still makes my chest ache when I watch her in a room. She got her father's patience, and, unfortunately, also his tendency to believe the best of people past the point where the evidence stops supporting it. That's where Kevin came in. She met Kevin Hartwell 18 months before the wedding at a fundraiser for her organization. He was there representing his family's construction company, Hartwell Development, which had donated materials for one of her housing projects. He was handsome in the way that photographs well, square jaw, easy smile, the kind of confident posture that reads as substance until you've known him long enough to realize it's just posture. He was 31. He told Emily she was the most purposeful person he'd ever met. He told her he admired her work. He told her on their 4th date that he'd never met a woman who made him want to be more. Emily called me after that date. She was laughing, a little embarrassed, a lot hopeful. He said I make him want to be more, she told me. More what? I asked. A pause. I didn't ask. I made a note of that. I didn't say anything. I met Kevin's mother, Margaret Hartwell, 3 weeks after Emily and Kevin announced their engagement. Margaret is 61. She has the particular bearing of a woman who was told she was beautiful at an impressionable age and organized her entire identity around it. She hosts charity luncheons. She chairs committees. She uses the word proper with a frequency that I find pathologically revealing. She greeted me at her front door wearing a cream blazer and a smile that didn't reach her eyes by several inches. "Catherine," she said, taking my hand. "We've heard so much. All of it accurate, I'm sure," I said. Her smile tightened slightly. A tell. I cataloged it. Dinner was what I would describe as an audition with catering. Margaret asked me twice about my work, not because she was interested, but because she wanted to decide how to categorize me. The second time she asked, I told her about a property dispute I'd won the previous month, a case involving a woman who'd been quietly written out of a marital estate by a husband who'd assumed her signature was decorative. "Oh," Margaret said. She picked up her wine glass. "How exhausting that must be, dealing with all that conflict." "I find it clarifying," I said. Kevin's father, Richard, who had said approximately 11 words over the course of 2 hours, glanced up at me then and held my gaze for a moment. Something moved across his face that I couldn't fully read. Possibly recognition, possibly relief. He went back to his food. After dinner, while Kevin and Emily were in the kitchen, Margaret took me to the sitting room and told me, over decaf coffee in china cups, that she was so glad Emily had Kevin to look after her, that nonprofit work was noble but precarious, and that a good husband was really the most stabilizing thing a woman could have in this world. Emily has always been remarkably self-sufficient, I said. "Of course," Margaret said warmly, "but there's self-sufficient and then there's settled. Kevin will give her that. He's very good at taking care of the people he loves." I drank my coffee. I nodded once. I thought about the apartment. I should explain the apartment. I'd been planning it for longer than Emily knew. Not because I distrusted Kevin specifically. At that point I was still in the assessment phase. But because I am a woman who believes in structural protection. I've spent 26 years watching what happens to women when the structure fails. When the document wasn't right. When the asset wasn't properly designated. When they trusted the permanence of something that turned out to be entirely conditional. I bought the apartment 14 months before the wedding. It's a 2-bedroom unit in a clean, well-maintained building 12 minutes from Emily's office. Good natural light, new kitchen. Building has a gym and a part-time doorman. I paid cash through a separate LLC I'd been maintaining for estate management purposes. I had my colleague Ramona Ashby, a family law attorney with 22 years in the field, draft the deed and all relevant protective language. Ramona has handled over 400 divorce proceedings in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and she is, in her words, professionally allergic to preventable catastrophe. The property was titled in Emily's name only, with explicit language designating it as sole and separate property, non-marital, non-community, immune to spousal claim under Pennsylvania law. I had intended to give it to her as a wedding gift regardless of how I felt about Kevin, because that's not the point. The point is that my daughter would always have a place to go. 60 years of happy marriage, she'd have a property asset. 60 days of miserable marriage, she'd have a door to walk through. I placed the envelope on the gift table at 11:17 a.m., 6 hours before the ceremony began. Plain white envelope, no bow, just her name in my handwriting on the front. I didn't think I'd need to open it at the reception. The ceremony itself was beautiful. I'm going to say that honestly because I think the truth of it matters. Emily was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the dress, though the dress was exquisite. Ivory silk, simple lines, the pearl earrings I'd given her that morning that had belonged to my mother. She walked herself down the aisle. That had been her choice, and it was the right one. She looked like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Kevin cried when he saw her. I watched him carefully. The tears looked real. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves. Kevin's vows included the phrase, "I will always put you first, and you will never have to carry anything alone." He said them looking directly at Emily. His voice didn't waver. I sat in the front pew and kept my expression neutral and thought, let it be true. Just let it be true. Richard Hartwell sat beside Margaret across the aisle. He had a handkerchief folded in his breast pocket that he didn't use. He watched his son with an expression I would later spend a lot of time thinking about. At the time, I read it as pride, maybe slightly melancholy pride, the specific variety that fathers get at weddings. In retrospect, I think it was something closer to guilt. The reception was at the Hartwell family's event space, a renovated warehouse in Kensington they used for company functions. It was elegant in a self-congratulatory way. Exposed brick, expensive florals, a bar with a dedicated cocktail named the Kevin and Emily. The seating was approximately 180 guests, split roughly along family lines. Emily's side, her colleagues from the nonprofit, a few college friends, her therapist, doctor, and Alicia Moreno, who'd become a personal friend, my firm colleagues, 2 women from the transitional housing program who Emily had specifically invited because she wanted them to see her happy. Kevin's side, the extended Hartwell family in full formation, his college fraternity brothers who had clearly pre-gamed, business associates, and a cluster of women at a back table who turned out to be Margaret's standing lunch group, a confederation who would later become relevant. The first hour was fine. Dinner was good. The toasts were warm. Kevin's best man, a man named Bryce who sells something in finance, gave a toast that was 40% inside joke, but harmless. Emily's colleague Thandiwi gave a toast that made half the room cry, which was exactly right. I was beginning to let myself relax. Then Margaret stood up. She didn't use the microphone, which in retrospect was strategic. A microphone creates a record. A room that's already gone quiet because someone important has risen from her seat creates a very different kind of intimacy. More intimate, more inescapable. She walked to the middle of the room carrying a box wrapped in silver paper. She was smiling. The full version this time, the one that reaches the eyes, and now I understand why. She'd been rehearsing for this. "I want to say something about my new daughter-in-law," she announced. The room settled. Emily looked up from her champagne with a carefully arranged expression of gratitude. She'd been managing Margaret's energy for 18 months by then. She knew how to do it. "Emily," Margaret said warmly, completely, "you are joining a family that takes pride in our home, in how we present ourselves, in the roles that make a house run well, and a marriage run well." A few murmurs. Appreciative. Kevin works hard. His father worked hard before him. And the women in this family have always known how to support that, how to hold the home together, how to be present for their husbands. Margaret's lunch group at the back table was already nodding. "So I wanted to give you something practical," Margaret said. "Something that says, you belong here, and we expect great things from you." She handed Emily the box. Emily opened it. I saw her face before I saw the contents. The color left it, not gradually, not with warning, just gone, like a curtain dropping. She lifted out a uniform, crisp white blouse, dark skirt, the kind you'd see on household staff, and there, on the chest pocket, stitched in navy thread, "Emily. So you're always presentable," Margaret announced, loud enough for every single guest to hear. "A good wife knows her role. She keeps the house, She keeps her husband happy. The women at the back table applauded. Actual applause. I set down my glass. Emily was still holding the bouquet in her left hand when Margaret pressed the uniform into her right. She stood there in her wedding dress, her mother's pearl earrings in her ears, holding a maid's uniform with her name stitched on it, and she didn't move. She was a person trying to locate themselves in a moment that didn't make sense. Then Kevin reached over. He plucked the uniform from her hands. He held it up in the air. He grinned at his mother like they had coordinated this, because they had coordinated this, because I could see in the fluency of that grin that this was not a surprise to him. Perfect fit, he said. She's going to need this. His brothers exploded laughing. His cousins, his uncle, the one who'd spent the cocktail hour making remarks about Emily, landing herself a good situation, and marrying well, slapped the table. I watched Emily's chin tremble. I watched her look at Kevin. I watched him look back at her with a smile still on his face. A smile that said, "This is who we are now. This is how it works. This is the shape of your life." And then I stood up. I want to be precise about what I did and did not feel in that moment because it matters. I did not feel rage. Rage is loud and it leaks and it hands the room to the person who caused it. What I felt was a kind of absolute crystalline clarity. The feeling I get when a case finally shows me its spine. When all the evidence stops being noise and resolves into a single clear line of argument. I picked up my purse. I pushed back my chair. I walked across the room at a normal pace because hurrying would have looked emotional, and I was not going to look emotional. The room began to notice. Not all at once. In ripples. A table at a time. I walked to the gift table at the front of the room. I lifted the plain white envelope with Emily's name on it. I turned around. "Emily," I said, "come here. I have something for you." She looked at me. Kevin looked at me. Margaret looked at me with the expression of someone who has just realized a play is going differently than she blocked it. Emily walked toward me. She was still in her wedding dress. She still had the pearl earrings in. She looked at me the way she used to look at me when she was small, and something had frightened her, with complete focus, like she was trying to determine whether this was going to be okay. I held out the envelope. "Open it," I said, out loud. She looked at me the way she used to look at me when she was small, and something had frightened her, with complete focus, like she was trying to determine whether this was going to be okay. I held out the envelope. "Open it," I said, out loud. She took it. She slid out the paper inside, unfolded it. Her eyes moved across the page, slowly at first, then faster. Then she stopped and looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on my daughter's face before. It was not a question. It was something past a question, something that had landed somewhere deeper. "Mom, read it out loud, sweetheart." Kevin moved toward her. So did Margaret. I watched them both close the distance, and I thought, yes, come close. I want you to hear every word. Emily's voice was almost nothing at first, a whisper finding its shape, but the room had gone completely still. 180 people holding their breath, and every word landed like it was amplified. "Property deed," she read. "Residential unit, apartment 4B, 1140 Haverford Avenue." She paused. Swallowed. "Owner, Emily Carter." Margaret's smile twitched, a small, involuntary collapse. That's just your married name," Kevin said. His voice had shifted. Not angry yet, just uncertain, which is its own kind of telling. "That doesn't mean anything." "Read the next paragraph," I told Emily. She did. "This property is designated as sole and separate property of Emily Carter, and shall not be considered marital or community property under any applicable law. In the event of divorce, legal separation, or dissolution of marriage, this property shall remain exclusively with Emily Carter, and no spousal claim shall apply." The room was a tomb, not quiet the way a room goes quiet out of respect, quiet the way a room goes quiet when it has just processed something irreversible. Kevin took the paper out of Emily's hands. He read it. He read it again. His jaw worked in that particular way of a man trying to find the right language for a situation his vocabulary was never built to handle. "You bought her an escape route," he said. He was looking at me. "Not Emily. Me. You planned this." "I bought my daughter a place to live," I said. "2 bedrooms, her name only. Whether she stays married for 60 years or 60 days, that apartment belongs to her. This is an insult to this family." Margaret had recovered enough to locate her voice, but it had lost its performance quality. What was underneath was thinner, more honest. "To my son, to everything you gave my daughter a maid's uniform at her own wedding," I said. "I gave her a deed. I think we both showed exactly who we are tonight." The silence that followed was not the same silence as before. This one had weight. It had direction. It was leaning on someone, and it was not leaning on me. Kevin's brothers were not laughing. The uncle had set down his fork. The cousins who'd been so entertained 40 seconds ago were finding the tablecloth extremely interesting. The women at the back table had stopped nodding. They were looking at Margaret with expressions that were beginning, carefully, reluctantly, to recalibrate. I looked at Richard Hartwell. He was the only person in the room who was not looking at Kevin, or at Margaret, or at me. He was looking at his plate, and that told me everything I would later need to know. What happened next happened in layers. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect moments like this to resolve cleanly, and they don't. They unfold over weeks and months, and they require sustained attention. But this is what happened in the room first. Kevin turned to his mother. Margaret turned to Kevin. They ran that private current they'd always operated on, the one I'd noticed at that first dinner, the one that excluded Richard. the one that had rehearsed this moment and had no script for what came after, and found nothing there to help them. Emily was still reading the deed. She'd taken it back. She was reading it the way you read something you want to memorize, moving through it slowly, deliberately, pressing each clause into herself. "You ruined tonight," Kevin said. He said it quietly. He wasn't performing anymore. This was the unmodulated version. Emily looked up from the deed. She looked at Kevin. She looked at the maid's uniform, which was still in his hand. He hadn't noticed he was still holding it. She looked back at him. I watched something move across my daughter's face in that moment. I have replayed it many times since. It was not sadness. It was not relief. It was something colder than either. Something that arrives when the last piece of evidence confirms what part of you already knew but wouldn't name. It was recognition. She folded the deed, slid it into the envelope, pressed it flat against her chest with both hands, like something worth protecting. Then she turned and walked back to her seat. She picked up her champagne glass. She took a slow, measured sip. She set it down with absolute precision, the stem resting exactly in the ring it had left on the linen. She did not cry. The reception ended 40 minutes later, which is to say it ended the moment I read that deed aloud. What followed those 40 minutes was the formal performance of its conclusion. People gathering coats and purses, the specific social choreography of a room clearing itself from an event that everyone will pretend, publicly, to be unable to fully remember. Dr. Alicia Moreno, Emily's therapist turned friend who holds a PhD in clinical psychology from Temple and has spent 15 years specializing in relational trauma, found me near the exit. She took my hand briefly. "She's going to be all right," she said. "I know," I said. "You should know," she added, "that what you did tonight was not just strategic, it was the right thing." I nodded. I didn't have words for that yet. Thandiwe, Emily's colleague, left with her arm around Emily's shoulders. The two women from the transitional housing program had stayed until the very end. One of them, a 24-year-old named Destiny, who Emily had helped relocate twice, caught my eye near the door and gave me a single, firm nod. I held it a long time afterward. Richard Hartwell called me 3 days after the wedding. He used the number I'd given Margaret 18 months ago, and apparently never used. He called at 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, which told me he'd waited until Margaret was out of the house. "Catherine," he said, "I owe you an apology." "You owe my daughter an apology," I said. "I'll relay the message." A pause. Then, I knew Margaret was planning something. With the uniform. I didn't think it would be. I didn't stop her. Why not? A longer pause. I've been not stopping her for 33 years. It becomes structural. I thought about what that word must have cost him to say. "Richard," I said, "I'll tell you something I tell my clients. Structural is not the same as unchangeable. Those are two very different things." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She's filing." I already knew. Emily had called me Sunday morning, 48 hours after the reception, and told me she'd spoken with a family law attorney. She'd told me in a voice that was calm and considered and heartbreaking in its lack of surprise. "I know," I said. He's not taking it well. That's for his attorney to manage." "The apartment," Richard said. "The deed. Did you know? Before the wedding, did you know what he was?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "I knew what she was," I said. "The rest was probability." He made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had anywhere to go. "The divorce proceedings took 7 months. Ramona Ashby handled Emily's representation. Ramona has been board certified in family law for 19 years, has handled over 500 dissolution proceedings in Pennsylvania, and has the specific gift of making opposing counsel feel they have wandered into a room they don't understand the dimensions of." Kevin's attorney, a man named Stephen Creel from a firm that does a lot of work for Hartwell Development, came to the first mediation session carrying what I can only describe as preemptive confidence. He argued that the apartment, despite its legal language, represented a marital asset by virtue of its intended use as a shared residence. Ramona let him finish. Then she laid out the deed, the protective language, the date of purchase, 14 months pre-wedding, and the chain of title documentation, all of which she had organized into a binder labeled simply Exhibit A. "There is no marital asset argument here," she said. "This property was purchased, titled and documented as sole and separate property under Pennsylvania Statute 23 PA-CS, paragraph 3501. We're happy to continue if counsel would like to proceed, but I want to be efficient with everyone's time." Stephen Creel asked for a recess. When he came back, Kevin's claims against the apartment were not raised again. The settlement was finalized on a Thursday in late February. Emily kept the apartment, her pension, her nonprofit's donor relationships, which Kevin had, at one point, threatened to contact, and the pearl earrings. Kevin kept the house they'd briefly shared, a jointly owned vehicle, and approximately 8 months of a marriage that ended before the plants they'd been given as gifts had time to die. I sat in Ramona's conference room when Emily signed the final documents. I watched my daughter's hand move across the page, steady, deliberate, unhurried. When she finished, she capped the pen and looked up, and I saw, for the first time since the wedding, her face fully at rest. Not happy exactly, not relieved exactly, just present, returned to herself. "Okay," she said. Okay, I agreed. There's a part of this that I've thought about more than any other part, and it isn't the deed, or the reception, or even Emily's face when she read the protective language aloud. It's Margaret. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I received a letter, handwritten, on Hartwell family stationery, from Margaret. It was not an apology. I want to be honest about that. It was 4 paragraphs of justification, a passage about tradition and family values, 2 sentences about how Kevin's happiness had been her only concern, and a final line that read, I hope you understand that I only ever wanted what was best for my son. I read it twice. I put it in a folder I keep for things that may later prove useful. What I've thought about since is not what Margaret wrote, but what she couldn't. She couldn't say, I was wrong. Not because the words don't exist for her, but because to say them would require her to understand what she'd done. And understanding it would require her to look at her son clearly, to see what she'd built in him, the entitlement she'd scaffolded into every room he walked through, the assumption, stitched carefully into him from boyhood, that the women in his life were there to be organized and assigned and managed. She gave my daughter a uniform. She'd been making one for Kevin his whole life. I don't know how to feel about that with any kind of simplicity. I've been doing it long enough to know that simple isn't the right ambition. Emily moved into apartment 4B on a Saturday in March. I helped her carry boxes. We ordered Thai food and ate it on the floor because her furniture wasn't arriving until Monday. We watched half a movie on her laptop and she fell asleep before the ending, and I put a blanket over her and sat for a while in her new living room while the city made its city sounds outside. Good natural light. Even at night you could tell. I thought about David. I thought about how he would have handled the reception. Not well, probably, but loudly and with conviction, which has its own value. I thought about the version of this story where I never bought the apartment, where I sat at table 3 and watched my daughter absorb that moment without anything in her hands to hold on to. I thought about all the women I've represented over 26 years who came to me after the structure failed, looking for legal architecture that should have been built before they needed it. Emily woke up an hour later, disoriented, and then laughing at herself. Sorry, she said. Long week. Long year, I said. She sat up and looked around her apartment. Really looked. The way you look at a space when you're beginning to understand it's yours. It's a good place, she said. Yes, I said. I'm going to be okay, she said, not asking, telling. I know, I said. I've always known. She looked at me. Did you know? She asked. About Kevin, before. I considered this carefully, because she deserved a careful answer. I knew enough, I said, to make sure you had somewhere to land. She nodded slowly, turned back to look at her apartment. The maid's uniform, she said quietly. He was still holding it when I walked away. I know. Did he ever notice? I thought about Kevin standing there in the wreckage of his mother's performance, grinning gone, uniform in his hand, trying to find words in a language that had no response for what I'd done. I don't think so, I said. Not then. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then, good. She reached over and took my hand. We sat there in her apartment, in the city dark, in the good light that came through even at night, and we didn't need to say anything else. Some things don't need language. The deed said everything. 6 months later, Dr. Alicia Moreno told me Emily had made more progress in therapy in those months than in the previous 2 years combined. Ramona Ashby sent a bottle of wine after the final settlement was signed. Richard Hartwell, I'm told, has been seeing a therapist of his own, a development I find neither satisfying nor surprising, just quietly appropriate. Emily still works 60-hour weeks. Her nonprofit just received a federal grant large enough to expand programming to 2 additional counties. She is, by any measure I know how to apply, thriving. Kevin and Margaret gave an interview to a local lifestyle blog 3 months after the divorce about the importance of family values and honoring tradition. The comment section was not kind. I read it once. I closed the tab. I had a contract to review. Some forms of justice are loud. Some arrive in comment sections. Kevin and Margaret gave an interview to a local lifestyle blog 3 months after the divorce about the importance of family values and honoring tradition. The comment section was not kind. I read it once. I closed the tab. I had a contract to review. Some forms of justice are loud. Some arrive in comment sections and courtrooms and public exposure. Mine arrived in navy thread on a chest pocket and in a plain white envelope placed on a gift table at 11:17 in the morning, 6 hours before anyone had any idea they would need it. I am my daughter's mother. That has always been the whole point.